um, is a creator of roadmaps of all shapes and sizes, personal, professional, team, and project. She is a senior software development manager at Audible, and she's also the programs director for the nonprofit Uplift. Previously, she was a software engineer for 5 years. She lives in Somerville, and in her spare time, she enjoys baking bread. All right, so Christine, I'm going to stop sharing so you can share your slides, and please give her a warm round of applause virtually, I guess.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for the introduction, Indira, and everyone at Women Who Code. I'm really excited to be here tonight and doing this virtual presentation. I was seeing people as we were getting started introducing themselves in the chat, but please continue to do that. I think it's cool to see people all over New England joining in, as well as far away, I think, as I saw LA, Miami, etc. In order to make this a little bit more interactive and hopefully engaging, we are going to do some activities throughout. So if you have a notebook or even just a piece of paper, that might help at later points. And yeah, I'm so excited to be here. So I want to start off just with Black Lives Matter. I think obviously this has been a big part of discussions, hopefully lately for ourselves, online, in person, and at our companies. But I really want to encourage, I think especially in women's spaces, it's extremely important to make sure that we are all committed to combating racism and really examining ourselves, our communities, our organizations, and really what we can do more. And I wanted to tell you about a specific opportunity if you hadn't heard of it yet, which is called G-Code House, which is in the Roxbury area in Boston. And they offer young women of color a safe co-living, working, and learning community. And specifically, their next cohort is going to be a combination of a boot camp, an internship, as well as a co-living space throughout. And what I really like about this model that I haven't seen in too many other places is that it really combines the concept of the educational component of becoming a software engineer with the financial and the reality that it's very hard to afford Boston rent prices, especially if you're not currently a software engineer. So I think it's a really exciting opportunity, a very important opportunity in the Boston area, and they're currently fundraising for renovations to their buildings. So if anyone's able to donate, I would encourage you to do that, as well as they are looking for mentors for the cohort and curriculum developers as they're leading up to their first cohort. So lots of exciting ways to get involved. So I'm Christine. I've been in the tech industry for about 6 years, first as a software engineer and now as a manager. And early on, I never believed that I would make it this far in the tech industry, not only to be speaking at events like this, but really to still be in tech. And that's because my first few years were really hard. I struggled to fit in on my team. I struggled to make progress in my career. I struggled to be seen as technical enough or even feel technical enough. Everything changed for me when I found my community. Now I develop resources to help women thrive in their first 5 years. One of the ways that I found my community actually was with my current team, which is Audible on Alexa. We deliver the audiobook experience to all of the Amazon Echo devices. And if you're not sure what that means, here are some of my favorite collection of different features that we've rolled out recently. So we have whole home audio on the left, which is the ability to say, read everywhere, or you can say, read this book in the kitchen or in the bedroom. And I think it's just a fun way to control your devices and just add more great experiences with technology to your life. We have What's Free from Audible, which is our listening event experience where every month there's a free book on the platform. This month, I believe we have The Swimmer, which is for Pride Month. And I know COVID-19 has brought lots of sleep challenges for all of us, definitely has affected me. So Audible has lots of sleep meditations, some of which narrated by celebrities. So exciting experiences there and hopefully, really impactful for people. And one of my favorite features, which I think just combines how powerful voice can be and just being a simpler interface, is that every time you need to contact customer service, it's always like a very complicated process that takes a long time. But just being able to say call Audible directly on the device that you're already on, I think is a cool innovation. My team in particular focuses on the new member experience. So join Audible. And about a year ago, our team was chartered with taking this experience, which existed in the US, and rolling it out to 5 new countries. There were only a few problems. We were almost all new hires. Most of the people on the team had been there less than 6 months. It had been estimated for being a few months, and it actually took much longer than that. And it was almost all configuration and translation work. And the configuration work was really what the problem was. To give you an idea of just how complicated that was, when we were working on the France launch, counterintuitively, what would happen is we would get the French copy from the team that was supplying that to us, but we actually weren't able to accept it in French. We needed to accept it in English so it could get translated to all the right countries, all the right languages. So it would get translated from English back into French, as well as all the other languages we needed to support. And then the team would review it, and maybe it wouldn't come out perfectly. As we know, translation is more of an art a little bit than a science. And so it wouldn't come out perfectly. And then we would need to repeat the process. And maybe even after a few times, there was a small change in the strategy, just a small change in the wording that they wanted to do. And that would again trigger a change through the copy. And every time through this cycle was actually lasting about a month due to a variety of factors on the team. So it was super frustrating. It was coming up almost every retrospective on the team. It was clearly our biggest challenge, and we needed a solution. To make matters worse, that wasn't even our only project that quarter. In addition to this internationalization project, we found out last minute about 2 exciting opportunities to offer special offers on Alexa, something that we wanted to do, but we're just unable to do successfully. So we had to rush to put together kind of a hacky solution in order to pull it all together. And it really came down to the same problem: configuration, translation. It was very frustrating. And what I learned from this experience is that no one was happy with our current state. Our team was unhappy. We weren't working on the kind of problems that we wanted to. The business was also unhappy though. We weren't delivering things at the speed that they wanted, and they were limited by the resources that we had. I discovered that we needed a roadmap. Without one, we were going nowhere. So we came up with this idea. Recognizing that our problem was the configuration, we needed to strip that out of our code base and into a tool that would allow this to be managed more flexibly. And specifically, something like this: selecting which people you wanted to receive a specific offer. So for example, setting up an offer for a trial experience. Adding the text, the content that you wanted to supply, for example, get a free month, and then adding in all the related metadata, the price, along with other things. And so you could set that configuration up and then set up another configuration, pretty similar, but maybe for members. And you can imagine adapting this into more and more offers. So that's what we did. Over the course of the next year, we built out a prototype tool of stripping this configuration work out of our code base. We launched our first offer through the tool. Through that process, we learned a lot about the experience. We inherited actually a lot of tech debt. There were a lot of bugs. A lot of really critical things had been found leading up to the launch. So we spent some time fixing those, stabilizing the platform. And then we took it and internationalized it, kind of solving our big problem that we had set out to do and rolling out a series of features using the tool. Next, we did our first country from scratch using this approach. And most recently, we hit the milestone that all the offers we needed to support are now configurable through the tool. And this process from end to end took over a year. It was a long time, but it was huge for our team. It transformed the focus of our team from being about specific features, but actually thinking bigger and thinking about the technology that we could use and ways that we could more flexibly solve the business problems. In fact, this changed the charter of our team. So whether you have a great idea or are looking for yours, whether you are looking to connect a few ideas into an actionable roadmap, or whether you're not sure where your ideas or your role would fit into creating a roadmap, we're going to talk about all that and more today in creating a roadmap. And it all starts with a vision. I think that's the most important part of creating a roadmap. When I think about a vision, I think about a quote from the book, The One Thing. What is the one thing you can do such that by doing it, everything else will be easier or unnecessary? And this highlights a really important point about roadmaps. You can't have a roadmap that goes in 10 different directions. Certainly, you can have 10 different projects that are a part of your roadmap, but if you're going in 10 different directions, that's not a roadmap. And by forcing yourself to limit yourself to the one idea, the one thing, you have to make some hard choices. You need to really synthesize and think about the problems on your team and identify what the root cause is. You need to identify what the best use of your investment is. Contrast this with an approach of just taking different technical projects as they come along, as they seem interesting, as there's maybe a little bit of data. That can get you far, and maybe each project provides some incremental value. But when you take a year, 2 years, 5 years for a team, that might not be getting you where you want it to be. For us, our one thing was to deliver new offers with no development work. And that was a really big vision. Arguably, we have not completely executed on that vision, but by working towards that, we got a lot farther and made huge progress beyond what we would have expected. A vision should be something pretty big, not achievable through a few projects or a few stories, but something that's probably going to take your team a year or two. To come up with a vision, maybe the idea has struck you in the past, but if not, I want to help you all come up with one. So here's an exercise that I think can work. And it's best actually if you don't just draw from what comes to mind right now, but maybe even take this back and collaborate with your teammates, or look back at past notes from maybe postmortems or retrospectives. But basically list out some existing problems on your team, and you can go big or small. They don't have to all be large. Come up with the ones that are the biggest ones, star those, and then really think, what is the one thing that you could do that would make a big difference? So I want to encourage all of you to try that. I'll give you 5 minutes so you can take your notebook and just jot it down. Again, it doesn't have to be great ideas. It can just be small or big, and see where you get with that. So it's 7:19, so we'll come back at 7:24, and then I'd love if people would share at that point. As you're wrapping up, we've got maybe a minute left. If there's a one thing that's coming to mind, or even just like an idea or question that's coming out of this, I'd love if you would share it in the chat. All right, I see Grace's hire more middle managers. I can't tell which part is the last name, but Amy maybe. Dependencies on external teams. I think that's a good one. I'm sure very common. In tech from Kathy, as a newly created team, we need to define our processes and create documentation. Absolutely. And maybe even hearing some of these are making you think of what some of the challenges might be on your team. Regular cadence of user contact and feedback. Yeah, absolutely. And portfolio. And one thing, find a mentor. Great. Yeah. And I think that Rena's point is great, because I think that these concepts, which we'll talk about a little bit more at the end, definitely can apply beyond just a technical roadmap, but to creating any other form of roadmap. No product vision for more than a month. Absolutely. So yeah, thanks everyone for sharing and for participating in the exercise. I know it can be a little awkward to participate virtually. So with that in mind, once you have your vision, right, the next step is obviously to think about what next steps you can take to execute on that vision. You need to come up with like the big idea for your project, and then you need to break that down. And there's a way to come up with your projects and to execute on that involves, you know, filling your jar all the way, taking up all of your team's time, being in a kind of very stressed mode. And there's a way to do it a little bit more intelligently, where you're able to actually plan out the time. And this all comes down to how you set up your projects. So the first thing to do with your big idea is to come up with the foundational projects related to it. So for example, for our project with building out the configuration system, we needed to have a prototype of the system, and we needed to internationalize that. Without those two components, we wouldn't have a system. From there, the next phase to include is, what are the upcoming business projects or related projects that kind of have dates or time frames that you want to work into your timeline? So for example, we knew we wanted to launch a special offer in July, and we also knew we had an internationalized offer that was launching towards the end of the year. And so that kind of gave us a sense that we could emphasize the US first and make sure we're internationalizing it by the end of the year. If we had known something else was going on, maybe we would have changed our roadmap. After you have those core components, you kind of break it down further into maybe the nice to haves, maybe a nicer front end, maybe more scalability, maybe more metrics. There's a lot of other things that are going to be critical to the success of it, but are not necessarily the foundational elements. And from there, you break it down even further. Once you have the projects, you obviously need to add some specific dates. So we're almost at the end of the second quarter of the year. So we have 2 quarters left in the year. And that means that you have half the year left to do a lot of different things. So I would think about, with your vision, where do you want to be by the end of the year? And then break that down further into quarters, so halfway. So where would you want to be by the end of September? And where do you want to be by the end of the year? And from there, you can break it down further into months or maybe even sprints, but I wouldn't really recommend going that far down because at a roadmap level, you don't want it to get so specific or rigid because you're still going to do your sprint planning or other approaches for kind of breaking down projects. And once you have some dates, it's important to zoom out and think, is this actually realistic? For us, I made a decision early on. I was very excited about the tool and I wanted to launch our first offer with the tool as soon as possible. But that kind of assumed that everything worked great with the tool. The tool ended up taking a lot longer than normal, and that led to a very stressful experience to launch the offer. And I think looking back, probably a smarter decision would have been to invest in launching that offer the old way, learn as much as possible from that experience, and really create a better tool to begin with. And when it comes to being realistic, really think about, is this assuming everything goes perfectly, or is this accounting for appropriate buffer time? This is also a good time to ask other people for feedback because maybe something seems realistic to you, but your team or other partners that you work with have a different perspective. And once you have a timeline, you want to add in specific milestones. I'm a big believer in milestones because it allows you to evaluate and check in along the way. When you're working on something as large as a roadmap, you don't want to just get to the end of the year and think, wow, is this working or not? It's important to have moments to check in. So for example, for our project, maybe there was an early milestone where testing was sped up and it was a lot easier to test. And then marketing owns one offer or marketing owns all offers. With this approach, if you have to stop at the end of phase 2, you still have something successful and you can still kind of check in and see how it's going. Compare this to a non-milestone approach where you actually just maybe work on stories as they come up in your sprint or just as different things come up. The problem here is, what does it really mean for half of the code to be refactored? If you have to stop the project here, that might leave your code in a worse state than before. And also, it doesn't really allow you to check in and see, is this actually successful? Are we getting the value that we thought from this? It's really just all or nothing. So piecing this all together, your projects, the right way of thinking about them, making sure it's realistic, and building out specific dates and milestones. Here are some of the milestones that we ended up with. So in the second quarter of 2019, we onboarded to the framework. Then right away, even though it was a little stressful, we were actually able to launch our first offer. And then we made the improvements to the framework. This is the bugs, the tech debt, etc. Then we launched internationalized offers. So this rolled out in multiple countries over the course of the next few months. Going back to our initial goal of launching brand new countries, we were able to start that process towards the end of 2019. And most recently, we hit the milestone that every feature that we needed has now been migrated to the tool. And along the way, we actually discovered a lot of other challenges or other things that we wanted to add to our roadmap. So we wanted to offer multiple offers through the framework. We wanted a new front end to make it easier to set up. And we wanted to automate the verification process. See, along the way, we realized that this was working good, but it could be a lot better in terms of being even easier to set up, even easier to catch errors more quickly and more efficiently. And that's fine. You don't need to create a roadmap and never change it, but being able to check in and see what you want to do can mean that you're now even more executing towards your vision. So you can have a great vision and you can have a great timeline, but if you're not actually able to get it prioritized and start the work, you won't really be executing a roadmap. In most companies, the main person or group of people that you want to convince is probably the business or your product team. And maybe that's because they have a certain amount of capacity and tech work is going to come out of that capacity. But however your company works, typically there's going to be a key stakeholder that you need to convince. And to convince them about your roadmap or about specific projects, you need to figure out what their top priorities are. In many cases, those are going to be financial priorities, or maybe there's specific metrics that kind of stand for financial things. So maybe there's a monthly active users or daily active users or trial take rate. There can be a lot of different metrics that are maybe their core metrics. And so when you're working with them or when you're kind of pitching your roadmap, think about how your projects fit into their goals. If they fit in, that's going to make it a lot more successful. And there can be ways where they very explicitly fit in. Maybe you're fixing a known issue, which is going to automatically improve those rates. And there can also be implicit ways. If you're making the work more efficient, they can roll out more of their projects, which are maybe contributing to those metrics. So you can think about both different perspectives. And while you're doing this, make sure that you're getting as specific and data-driven as possible. Hearing that something is going to reduce errors or be faster or be more efficient doesn't really mean anything if it's not concrete. Make sure that you're doing your best to really estimate, to really get at these numbers, even if it seems initially hard to do. And in addition to your business, there's a lot of other people that you're going to want to convince. So some specific questions that I like to ask are these. So why is this idea good for the customer? Like the business, this can be both explicit and implicit. If you're fixing an error rate, that's obviously objectively good for the customer. But again, if you're making things faster so that new features are coming more quickly, or if this speeding up is going to enable them to get access to more things, there can also be implicit ways. Why is it good for the business? Again, focus on the metrics they care about. And speaking of metrics, if this relates to team or company goals, make sure you're emphasizing that and finding a way to measure that. You know, best case scenario for your project is there's an important OKR or initiative for your organization, and your projects can fit into that. The next three questions are kind of zooming out, taking a step back and thinking, is this really what we need to do right now? So what is the impact if this is not delivered? There can be lots of good projects, but maybe without them, things are not too different. Or maybe there's just other really high priority things right now. So taking the time to write this out can be super useful. Again, why is now the best time to prioritize this? I think it's really important to have that idea, even if you're not presenting it for someone, but for yourself. And what is the right level of investment right now? You don't always work on a whole technical project right away in one sprint or anything like that. You're typically working on it over a long period of time. So what milestone do you want to get to next, or what is the best thing to be doing right now? So I want to encourage you to think about these. So for our second exercise, think about a project either directly related to your vision, or if there's another project you've been trying to get buy-in for on your team, or even a personal project. Think about one of these questions and maybe two of them, and really write down some notes for yourself. And I'll give you 5 minutes. So it's 7:36, so 7:41. So as we're wrapping up this section, if you want to share any insights you've taken from this or any short, probably can't type out your whole answer, but any answers that you're thinking of, that would be great so people can learn from you. All right, we'll take 30 seconds to wrap this up. And I see some answers coming in. So good for the business. Business can monetize based on the project. So that's a great project when it has clear business goals. Why is now the best time to prioritize? People are burning out, morale is low. I think that's very good time to prioritize. Setting our team processes and documentation standards now will allow us to create cohesive UI across all products, which improves the customer experience. Yeah, and I think that one also probably fits in with like, why is now the best time to prioritize if you're going to prevent yourself from having to redo that all later. Great. And impact of not delivered, loss of revenue. That's, yeah, great reason to do it now. So yeah, I think another takeaway I was just thinking as we were working on this is just that, again, it can be a very explicit reason, like people were saying, like increase in revenue or loss of revenue, as well as maybe an implicit. So if you can tie upcoming projects and really frame it in terms of how this will affect it, like maybe with the, you know, getting the standards done right now, how will this affect needing to add more work for later projects? So in addition to convincing your number one stakeholder, whoever that might be, make sure that you're really collecting feedback from as many people as you can think of, probably more roles than you even think might need to be a part of this. So for example, for us, we wanted to work with our product team, our UX team, our QA team, our marketing team. If you're in a company with kind of clients that you work with or external customers that you work with, you probably want to get their feedback. Maybe there's other development teams. I know someone had one about dependencies. So maybe dependency teams are people you want to collect feedback from. I think really most roadmaps and most ideas are better if you get feedback from a lot of different people. So really take the time with this stage. And when you start executing your vision, it's going to take a long time. Again, our roadmap is still going and has been going for about 1.5 years at this point. It's very important to remind yourself and your team where you're going and where you have been. So not every phase of your roadmap or every project is necessarily going to be super exciting or super fun, but by making sure that you all understand how does this fit in. So maybe right now we're working on this challenging project, but once we do this, we're going to be at the next phase of this project. And once we get there, that's going to mean this for our team, for our business, for our company. So taking the time to really recognize that for yourself, measure that, and share that with your team can be super valuable. So those are the kind of 3 different components of creating a roadmap. But having all these things right doesn't actually give you a roadmap. You need to actually piece it all together. So here's some example formats that I've seen. I don't think that you have to pick exactly one, but take the parts from each one that you think best fit who you're needing to convince and who you're writing the roadmap for. So this one is pretty common. Basically, it's a very short form roadmap. And I think that this is probably ideal for organizations or maybe teams that have very clear different roles or different projects. So the key idea here is that you have on the left different things that you focus on. So maybe this is an organization that has different priorities or different buckets where they spend their time. And then you have the timeline and different projects that are part of your roadmap. And the benefit here is that it's very easy to see what's going on when. Maybe you notice like, wow, this iOS upgrade is taking a long time. And that's something that you can really visually see from there, as well as if you have a goal or a rule of not having too many projects at once, you might notice that, wow, March and February are pretty busy. But with just this, unless you have a lot of context on the projects, there's not a lot that you can really go from. So another form, which is kind of the complete opposite, is where you really take the questions that we were writing and you really write a roadmap that motivates itself, that really clarifies why we're doing this, what each step of the way is. It is much more narrative in format. And this can be super helpful if you're trying to convince someone about this, if you don't already have buy-in. And in general, I think it's a really helpful exercise for yourself to really take the time to write out all of this. But of course, if you have a very long one and lots of different projects, it can be hard to really see the bigger picture or see how these things all fit together. So another one, which is probably the most common version that I've seen, is kind of a combination of what's good about both approaches. So you can take the different projects or different areas. You can mention which projects you're specifically focusing on. And then you're actually adding in some of the motivational information, but in a way that makes it easier to compare. So maybe there's success criteria. And again, this would be a time to really be as specific as possible. There's a target launch date, so you can get an idea of when these things are happening. You can get an idea of the size. Maybe you add in more information for your team, like a point of contact, dependency teams. And you also have a priority here, which I think is an important element regardless of what format you're choosing. It's really important to emphasize what the priorities are so that when you have to start making hard decisions later on, you're able to do that. Common pitfalls. So along the way, right, I think there's a lot of different things that I've learned definitely through roadmaps, and I've seen other people experience as well. So I wanted to share a few of them. One of them is being so focused on the goal that you're only focused on the goal. And again, the problem is that this is going to be a long time. You don't want to see everything as a failure up until the point where you finally see success. And again, you're probably not only focused on the roadmap. So make sure that you're really, recognizing where you're going, where you've been, finding ways to celebrate wins, even small ones along the way. The second one is not enough milestones. So we talked about the importance of milestones earlier, and I think this is a huge one that I see everywhere, where you have this giant project, it's so large, you could never break it down, and maybe you have to pause it at different points, and that's super frustrating. And you also just really don't have any way to see how it's going. The third one is being too rigid. So again, this is going to be a long time. It's important to recognize that you're not going to write the perfect document and then perfectly execute that. That's not really a thing that's going to exist. And I think once you realize that, it's important to be flexible and figuring out really all the benefits of flexibility, like recognizing early on that an approach that you had been, planning your whole roadmap about is not going to work. That is a really important insight that you want to take into account rather than just continuing to execute on that, even though it's not really working out. So take a time to set checkpoints to really evaluate how it's going and possibly to redo your roadmap at various points. A lot of companies will have different times of the year where maybe that's a continuous process. And even if that's not something that's occurring at your company, I think it's a good thing to do. And finally, lack of measurement. So I think a lot of software engineers are very data focused, and lots of other roles as well. But I think sometimes for roadmaps or like technical projects, we're not always applying that same rigor. So make sure that you have a hypothesis. So again, for us, it was this tool was going to really change things on our team. Make sure that you have a way to measure if that was actually successful. And that can be hard because maybe you do that and you realize, wow, this is not as successful as I wanted. But that's a lot better than just having no idea or continuing to just kind of go on with different projects. So make sure that you're taking time to have a measurement to really reflect on how it's going, and ideally with milestones that can be along the way. So I'm a big believer in like actions and kind of committing to things and really making change that way. And I think especially in a webinar environment or even in a virtual environment that we've all been working probably, that can be a lot harder to do. So I want everyone to just think about everything we've talked about, whether it's like explicitly something we talked about or just something you were thinking of maybe during the downtime, and really think about what's one step you could take this week. So a small step, not something that's unrealistic, and then just share that in the chat so we can all be motivated by each other. From Grace, block out deep thinking time to work on step 1, articulating a vision. That's really good. And I think I've noticed that it's a lot harder to have deep thinking time remotely. So I think taking the time to block that out and maybe close your, Slack client and that kind of stuff, I think is super important. Reach out to the UX community and ask if anyone could be my mentor. That's really good and connects with your goal from above. Reach out. I think actually now is a great time to find a mentor because I think everyone's starting to realize, wow, we actually could be remote mentors. I think before that seemed like something that was not possible. Reach out to a potential partner team to see if they have an interest in the feature. That's really good. Good way to collect feedback. Collect feedback from alpha users and get more alpha users. That's really good. Pulling in a new UX researcher who needs a portfolio piece. Connect with someone on another team. Bring a first version of a roadmap onto paper and modify it later. Yeah, I think it's much better to do something, very rough, maybe present that to your team or your manager, or just a friend. That is much better than kind of waiting until you have the perfect thing. So great. I'm really excited to hear about all those things and feel free to keep me updated on how it's going. So I wanted to close by talking about something that I think has come up a little bit throughout the exercise. But really, there's a lot of applications for roadmaps beyond just a technical roadmap. Hopefully your company has a product roadmap. You can develop a roadmap for your life. You can develop a roadmap for maybe your anti-racism journey. I think a big discussion I've seen online that I think is important to emphasize is like, we shouldn't all just like cram a bunch of books or movies right now, but we should really think about like, what am I actually going to do to change my life in the next year? And I think another important area for roadmaps is your career journey. So developing a roadmap for your career. And one of the things that can get in the way of doing this, especially as a woman in tech, is the statistic, which shocked me when I first heard it, which is that 54% of women in tech end up leaving the industry within the first 10 years. So this is double the rate that men are leaving the industry. It's also higher for women of color. And the studies that have been done on this really demonstrate that it's actually not really about the personalities or traits of the women, but more about the traits and characteristics of their teams and of their managers. And so it's kind of sad when you see this. I'm working on changing this story, and I would love to include you. You can share your story in the tech industry, specifically your first few years, privately on my website. And I'm using this to develop resources to help women thrive in their first 5 years in the tech industry. I believe we can change the story. So that's all I have for the content of this presentation. You can contact me on LinkedIn or Twitter. You can share your story on my website. I also have a way where you can get some resources that we talked about today if you just wanted to refer to that later. And I also wanted to plug G-Code House again and their fundraiser that they have going on. So thank you so much for listening and for Women Who Code for hosting as well. And I think at this point, we're going to move into the Q&A, which I think you can do through the chat. Yeah, anything else you want to note, Indira, about how that's going to work?
Yeah, I think people are automatically muted unless you're a co-host, so it might be hard to unmute people. So if you do have questions, as Christine said, post them in the chat and we can go through them together.
While we're doing that, I'll just briefly, while we're waiting for questions to come in, highlight, because I saw some comments about this earlier, but if you liked the artwork, you can actually download that from this group called Fresh Folk, as well as presentation templates and that kind of stuff. So just a fun thing to plug.
Christine, could you also share your slides with us, maybe in the chat?
Sure, in the chat. I don't know how I would do that.
Is it a PowerPoint slide or something?
It's a PowerPoint, yeah.
It's a bit hard.
Yeah, I could probably do something and send that. Maybe if you wanted to email people who attended afterwards, or I don't know if that would work.
Yeah, I think that would work. We can share them through Meetup afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you everyone for the nice comments. Yeah, if you have any questions, you can put that in here as well. And I also know sometimes it's awkward or hard to think of a good question in the moment. So feel free to reach out to me later if that would be easier. Could you email slides? Yeah, I probably will not email the slides because I feel like that's hard to get the content, but I have a PDF that's like a simpler version, and you can also get that on my website.
About the recording, this is recorded and this will get uploaded to YouTube, I believe. Shane or Kathy, please correct me if I'm wrong. You can go to youtube.com/womenwhocode, I think, and it has all the talks from Women Who Code, not just from Boston, but also all the different chapters around the world. So definitely check that out.
Great. And I did see a question come in. Is there a specific format or tool you prefer to use for recording and updating your roadmap? So I personally adapt the tool that I use to the organization that I'm a part of. So, if your group is typically, writing PowerPoints to convince people or like doing it more like a meeting style, or if you're, mostly passing documents, in my company, we're typically using like wikis and that type of stuff. So that would be the format that I would write it in. If you're probably at a design-based company, maybe the presentation component would be more important. So depending on like what it is, I would think about what is the way that people normally present this. And again, like I think one of the people was saying earlier, was that maybe Pat, someone was saying, it's important to get a simple version of this done. So don't like stress yourself out about the format. And I think if I were doing one for myself, I would just kind of keep something that's going to be easy to access and easy to update, just because that would be my preference. What do you recommend women do to stay motivated about staying in the tech industry? Yeah, I think this is, I'm sure, very different for everyone. At one point, several years ago, I had a Medium blog about my thoughts at the time, and I think even since then, my thoughts have changed. I think everyone should do what is best for them, which is sometimes hard to figure out, but I don't think anyone, like I think it was at Grace Hopper 2015, I think Sheryl Sandberg said something that was like, everyone should stay because they need to or something. That was like what I took away from it or whatever. I don't think that's super, that's by the way, a very terrible quote, but I don't remember what it was exactly, but like that was my takeaway, was like, this is something you need to do for people that are going to come or whatever. And I think that maybe that motivates a certain type of person, but I think that's also like a kind of stressful way to live your life, right? If that's not something you're really opting into. So I think I would say, I think that in many cases, if the data right is showing that it's kind of the managers, the teams, I think what's good about that is it shows that you have some flexibility to try things out, to find a team, to find a company, and to learn from those different experiences. So I think if you're having a bad experience, think about what are the things that you don't like about it, and how could I come up with the perfect interview question or the perfect message someone on LinkedIn from the company about this question to kind of figure out, is this that kind of company or is this a different kind of company? And I think that, if it is something where you're trying to stay and that's something you're struggling with, as I said at the beginning, I think for me, finding my community was really important. And I think that can come through groups like Women Who Code. It can come through groups at your office or through people on your team or people at your company that you do feel comfortable with. And I think even remotely now, I think it can come through online communities and that kind of stuff. And so I would really find the people, and then I think from there, hopefully they can figure out what you should do. How do you recommend aligning this roadmap and road mapping process with others in your org who do similar planning? I think a way that it works at my company, we typically do kind of some longer term planning, and then we do more quarterly planning for kind of the shorter term to like reevaluate things. And I think that in most cases, you probably want to be on a similar roadmap as the product roadmap. So if the product roadmap is like 3 years out is typically what you're talking about, or it's a year out, and you're doing things at a completely different cadence, you're probably bringing things in at a time that is not super helpful. If they already know what's happening, and then you have all these other great ideas, even if they're great, that might not be the right time for them. So I would figure out like what the right way is to propose that. And depending on your role, maybe that involves working with some of these people or working with your manager to really elevate these. But in general, you probably want to be on the same cadence as them so that you're able to really get buy-in for this. And in my company, we have a certain percentage of time can be allocated to technical projects, which helps us have a little bit more control. But if you're fully having to like get this as having the same amount of weight as some of the product epics, then I think it's even more important to have the data to back it up and to get it in at the right time so that they can consider that for their roadmap. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I know we all have a lot of different things we could be doing in quarantine, and sometimes it's tiring after a long day. So really appreciate you spending this evening with Women Who Code. And yeah, I would love to be in touch afterwards. So feel free to reach out anytime. And yeah, I don't know if there's anything else you want to do, Indira, to close.
Just wanted to say thank you so much, Christine. I think I speak for everyone when I say that this has been a really helpful and informative talk. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. For everyone else on the call, if you'd like to be more involved with Women Who Code, if you're not already on our Slack channel, please feel free to message me right now and I can add you to it. We're trying to make it a more engaging community. We'll try to post more resources on there. You can also follow us on Twitter for more updates on other events that we're doing throughout the rest of the year. So yeah, I think with that, anything else, Sheena, Kathy? Good, all right, cool. Yeah, again, thank you so much, Christine. Have a good night, everyone. Bye.